Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Daniela and I make sewing and DIY videos. In this video I'm going to show you how to draft and sew a collar and a collar stand for any blouse, shirt or dress. You can follow these steps to draft a collar for women, men and children and in any size. You can draft a collar to finish a self-drafted project that you have or to change up a bit a commercial pattern that you like. I use the same technique to draft a standalone stand like this and a collar with a stand like here. So without further ado, let's see how to do it. Here is my dress that I want to finish with a collar. To start drafting the stand, I need the measurements of the neckline. You can take the measurements on the actual garment that you are sewing, or you can measure on the pattern if your project is not self-drafted or if it's a ready-to-wear. For best results, one of the most important things here is to match the length of the neckline with the length of the stand. That's why you need to be careful when you take the measurements. To make sure that I'm going to measure precisely, I pinned the front placket on both sides. You can also fix with a stitch. I do that to make sure it doesn't open and change the length of the neckline. Then I draw the seam line with a piece of chalk. To draft the right length of the collar stand, I need to measure at the seam line and not at the edge. That's because I need my finished stand to match the actual neckline curve. If I measure at the edge, the seam allowance that I've already included will make my stand too short. Keep that in mind if you work on a pattern with or without seam allowance included. You need the measurement of the neckline without seam allowance. Then I'm folding the neckline in half and pin it while matching at the shoulder seams and the fronts. This way it would be easier to measure. Also, I'm going to be drafting the collar and collar stand pattern on fold and I'm going to need half of the neckline measurement. I measure the seam line and write down my center back to shoulder seam measurement and my half neckline measurement. For this pattern, those are the only two measurements you are going to need. The other two, which are the height of the stand and the height of the collar, are a matter of personal preferences, although there are some standards here, but I'll get to that when I start drafting. For this draft, I'm going to use a clear grit ruler, a piece of paper and a marker to make sure it will show better on video. To start the draft, I'm going to measure and apply my half neckline measurement and mark points A and B. Then I square up from point A and apply the height of the stand, which I like. That would usually be 1¼ inches or 3 centimeters for a standard height of the stand. Here I mark point C. Measuring from point A, I apply my center back to shoulder seam measurement and mark point D. Square up from point D, apply the height of the stand once again and mark point E. Square up from point B as well. Measure 1 inch or 2½ centimeters on that new line and mark it point F. Connect points D and F with a straight line. Align the ruler with line DF, put the right square at point F and apply the height of the stand once again. Mark point G. Connect points E and G with straight lines. Use the curved part of the ruler to smooth the lines of the stand at points D and E. Shape the end of the stand at the center front. I'm going to use the bigger curve here and use my free hand to shape. You can curve a bit more or less here. Draw the shape that you like for the finished stand. I am going to mark the straight grain parallel to the center back fold. Then I'm going to mark the center front, center back fold and shoulder notch on the pattern. Mark the seam allowance all around except the fold line and connect the marks to outline the pattern. I like to go with a smaller seam allowance here, like 3/8 of an inch or so. A bigger seam allowance means more fabric bulking on the inside, and this could be a problem when sewing. To draft the collar, I'm going to need its length. I would usually make the collar 3/8 of an inch or 1 cm shorter than the top side of the stand. I'm going to mark that point on the stand and then square down to transfer to the AB line. Mark point H. The length of A to H would be the length of the collar. Start drafting the collar by applying the A to H measurement and mark it A to B. Apply the height of the collar plus 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters. The standard for the collar is 2 inches or 5 centimeters. You can make it higher or lower depending on your design preferences. I want a 2-inch wide collar, so I measure 3 inches straight from point A and mark point C. Then I do the same from point B and mark point D. Connect points C and D to form a rectangle. Measure 1 inch up from point A and mark point E. The other 2 inches are going to be the center back fold of the collar. I'm going to use the curved part of my ruler to connect points E and B. Use a part on the curve that makes a smooth and natural curve. To further shape the collar, extend 1 inch from point D. Connect with point B. Mark the center back fold and the grain line, which is parallel to the center back. And that is the shape of the basic collar. If you prefer a different design, you can shape the collar further. For example, make a pointier angle at the front like this. Or curve the ends like this. I'm going to use the basic collar pattern to sew the dress. I'm adding 3/8 of an inch or 1 cm seam allowance all around except at the center fold. I'm going to cut out my patterns. For the stand, I'm cutting the pattern with the seam allowance as drafted. Plus, I've cut one from thicker paper and followed the seam line. I'm going to use this pattern later when I sew to get the stand even on both sides. I have my pattern ready, so I start cutting the pieces. I need 2 collar pieces and 2 collar stand pieces. I used my final scraps to cut the stand. I put the center fold mark of the pattern on the folded fabric, minding the grain line. I pin and cut the stand. I also transfer the notches. Then I repeat with the collar. I made the collar black because my initial idea was to finish the neckline with a standalone collar stand like on the first dress. But then we envisioned the dress with a collar, and that led to other design changes like adding black elastic to the waist and black tulle to the hem. Here are the pieces that I'm going to need. I'm going to need 1 collar and 1 collar stand from this fusible interfacing. The interfacing will add stiffness and shape to the details. If you need to learn more about interfacing, I'll link to a post I've written in the description below. I've interfaced 1 collar and 1 collar stand, and I'm about to start sewing. The first thing I'm going to sew is the collar. I'm sewing both collar pieces face sides together at 3/8 of an inch or 1 cm seam allowance. Start at the side and backstitch at the beginning. When you get to the corner, keep your needle down, lift the foot and pivot the fabric. Sew the top side of the collar. Pivot at the other corner too and finish at the end of the side with a backstitch. To prevent bulks of fabric and to get the corners of the collar sharp and pretty, cut the seam allowance at the corners at 45-degree angle. You can also cut the seam allowance all around if you prefer, but not too close to the seam so you don't break it. Then turn the collar inside out and using the tweezers or other prop, push the corners from the inside until they are nicely shaped. At this point, I would also go and iron press to make sure everything is sharp and even on both sides, because if it's not, it might really show later on the finished garment. Then I'm going to top stitch at the face side at 3/8 of an inch, pivoting with my needle down at the corners and backstitching at the beginning and the end. The next step would be to sew the collar stand and the collar. I need to sandwich the collar between 2 collar stand pieces, but this could be challenging, so I'm going to attach one stand piece first and then the other. I make sure that the interfaced details are on the same side because this can really make a difference in the appearance later. This means that the interfaced collar and stand should be facing each other. I'm pinning one stand to the collar and sew it from one notch to the other. Then I take the interfaced stand, which I pressed at 3/8 of an inch at the bottom, and pin it to the other side of the collar. If you are sewing a standalone collar stand like on my first dress, just join the stand details at the top like here, but without a collar sandwiched in between. At this point, I'm going to use the no seam allowance pattern to draw the seam line even on both sides with a piece of chalk. This can be very useful because sometimes you might cut just a bit more or less on one side, and then the difference will be very easy to notice on the center front where these seams are going to be. I start sewing in the middle and go all the way down while sewing through the folded edge as it is. Then I repeat with the other side. I have my collar sewn and I'm going to flip the stand over and iron press it one more time before I attach it to the neckline. I'm going to pin the collar stand to the neckline, starting at the center front on one side. I take my time to align best here because every millimeter off shows very much on the finished garment. I'm pinning the non-folded, non-interfaced collar stand to the neckline, face sides together. This way my interface detail will stay on the face side, which is what I'm aiming for to get the best appearance and functionality. I pin the other side, align nicely to the center front and then both shoulder seams to the shoulder notches. I put a couple more pins here and there to make sure everything is staying in place. Sew the collar stand to the neckline. Our collar is already attached to the dress. We need to sew the other side of the stand. I've seen some seamstresses hand stitch it down. I personally am not a fan of hand stitching and prefer to do most of my sewing on the machine. Here's how I've learned to do it in industrial sewing. I'm going to put the seam allowance in and top stitch very close to the edge. I'm going to pin it and make sure that the back side of the stand is right at the same level as the front side, which I'm going to sew on. This way my seam won't drop down at the back and go over the back bodice detail. You can stop here with a back stitch, or you can go all around the stand for extra support like I'm going to do. I did that on this dress, but skipped it on the other one with the standalone stand for a more delicate look. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, give it a like, subscribe to my channel and also ring the bell to get updates when I post a new video. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I appreciate you all very much and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!